My name is Jennifer Allen. I'll be presenting a project titled Scaling Up Fact-Checking Using the Wisdom of Crowds. Um, this is joint work with Antonio Arechar, Gord Pennycook, and Dave Rand. Great. At this point, I think all of us are familiar with the problem of fake news proliferating on social media, and hopefully we're interested in solutions. And so one strategy that platforms like Facebook have been using to combat fake news on their platforms is recruiting third-party fact checkers to fact check and moderate content on their platforms and then taking it down. And so this approach sounds great and really, all well and good until we realize there's a pretty big problem. This is an article published in 2020 that says that Facebook's 6 fact-checking partners can only fact-check roughly 200 pieces of content per month. And this is really just a drop in the bucket when we consider that Facebook has more than 1 billion posts per day. And so clearly, Facebook has a huge scaling problem when it comes to fact-checking. And so the question that we as researchers are interested in is, can the wisdom of crowds help solve this problem of scale? And TLDR, we think the answer is yes. So a little bit of background, what makes us think that using the wisdom of crowds in this arena might be useful or possible. So this is a plot from a previous paper by this research group that looks at how the wisdom of crowds might be used to replicate expert ratings about the trustworthiness of sources. So we found that in aggregate, both Democrats and Republicans trust mainstream news outlets, like the New York Times, LA Times, more than they trust fake and hyperpartisan outlets like Daily Wire and InfoWars. And this was a really exciting finding and in some ways pretty surprising given the polarized nature of the news media. And so not only did we find this exciting and surprising, so did Facebook. And so Facebook actually saw this research and came to us and said, this is great. And this is great that this works so well for sources. But what we're really interested in is articles. Can this work for articles? And so fact-checking articles is an order of magnitude harder than determining the trustworthiness of sources because lay people are less likely to be familiar with individual articles than they are with big sources like New York Times or even Breitbart. So this was definitely a challenging problem, but one that we thought lended itself well to an experiment. And so that's exactly what we did. So yes, as part of this collaboration with Facebook, they gave us access to 207 articles flagged by their algorithm as potentially false or misleading. So these were articles that were, flagged as potentially questionable in some way. So a difficult set to fact check, but one that was held a lot of ecological validity. In addition to this set of stimuli, we also recruited a group of 3 fact checkers from the site Upwork to read the articles and then research their veracity. This was a pretty intensive process. They went through an extensive vetting process. And then we also had them not only fact check the articles, but also provide sources and then explanations and justifications for their decisions. And so the ratings that we asked them to provide were first a categorical rating about whether the article was true, misleading, false, or they weren't sure. And we also asked them to provide 7 7-point Likert scale ratings about the accuracy of the article. These are the 7 questions that we used. And we actually averaged them all together to create an aggregate accuracy continuous rating for each article. Great. So before we even move to the crowd, the first thing we want to ask is, how well do the fact checkers agree with each other? What is the correlation between fact checkers? And so we find that the average Pearson correlation between fact checkers on the Likert scale ratings is about 0.62. And so this is a pretty good correlation in the scheme of social science research. It's a fairly large correlation, but it's certainly not one. And so, in some ways, this isn't surprising. We gave them a very difficult stimulus set of articles that were already potentially questionable, and in which there was not necessarily an obvious black and white truth. But this is the benchmark with which we will then measure the performance of the crowd. So that this 0.62 is the sort of upper bound of agreement that we found between the fact checkers. So now moving on to the crowd. We recruited 1,200 Americans from Amazon Turk. They gave us 20 ratings, 20 headlines per rater and 50 ratings per headline per condition. We had two conditions, a source condition and a not source condition. In both conditions, lay people were asked to rate the headline and the lead of the article and perform no research. We asked them to do this because we were interested in scalability and we didn't want them to spend a lot of time doing research about the article at the expense of speed. And in addition to the headline and lead, people in the source condition saw the domain of the article, for example, Breitbart.com, as an additional piece of information that we thought might help them make their decision. And we asked them to perform the same ratings of the same Likert scale ratings as the fact checkers did. And as an outcome measure, we looked at the correlation between the politically balanced layperson rating and the average fact checker rating as a function of the number of layperson ratings per headline. And what do I mean by the politically balanced fact checker, or the politically balanced crowd rating? We actually grouped participants by their self-identified political leaning, Democrat or Republican. And then we randomly sampled an even number of Democrats and Republican responses, averaged them together to create a politically balanced layperson response. And so this is, again, a way that we were able to balance the crowd politically, which is important for, an important consideration for Facebook, who might face allegations of bias. In addition to looking at the correlation between the lay people and the fact checkers, we also looked at the AUC of a model that used the that used the layperson continuous ratings to predict the categorical fact checker ratings. So we use these two measures as a way to evaluate how well the crowd was able to predict the fact checkers' ratings of the accuracy of articles. So how well do the lay people do? So as I alluded to before, here we have a plot with the Pearson correlation between the average fact checker and the crowd on the y-axis, and we have the number of responses in the crowd on the x-axis. And so we're interested in learning how the performance of the lay people scales with the size of the crowd. So here are the results. As you can see, around 10 responses, the performance of the crowd matches the performance of the fact checkers as measured by the Pearson correlation. And beyond that, actually, around 20, around a crowd of size 20, the lay people actually outperform the experts. In addition, the source condition marginally outperforms the no source condition, but the difference between the two is small. So this is a really encouraging finding. We see that the crowd is able to correlate as well with the average experts as they are able to correlate with each other, which is, I think, a really good sign about the potential for incorporating these sort of crowd ratings in a fact-checking pipeline. So the correlation is interesting because it allows us to compare the crowd ratings to this expert benchmark, but it's not very interpretable. So we're also interested in how we can use crowd ratings to actually predict the binary ratings of the experts. And so to do that, we look at the AUC of a model where we use the crowd's average ratings to predict the fact checkers' categorical ratings. And we code the fact checkers' categorical ratings as 0 if they label the articles as false, misleading, or they can't tell, and 1 if they label the articles as true. And so we were sort of interested in grouping everything that was bad together. So 0 sort of represents bad articles, and 1 represents true, good articles. And so as with the correlation, we were interested in benchmarking the crowd against the agreement of the experts. So we actually split the stimuli into 2 groups, one in which all the fact checkers agree, and so there's unanimous consensus among whether the article is true or not true among the fact checkers, and then a group in which of articles in which the fact checkers disagree. And so 2 fact checkers might agree that an article is true, but 1 might say that it's not true. And we would expect that the crowd is able to better predict the ratings of the articles in the unanimous condition than they are in the non-unanimous disagreement condition. And so what do we find? So first, in the unanimous condition, we see that around 20 responses, we're seeing an AUC of at or above 0.9 for a model that predicts, for a model that uses the Likert scale ratings of the crowd to predict the binary truth ratings of the experts, which is really good. And for articles in which the fact checkers disagree, we're seeing, as we expected, a lower AUC. And so we're only seeing an AUC of around 0.75 in those cases, which is still, in the grand scheme, pretty good, especially when you compare to machine learning models that use machine learning methods to detect true from fake news. These sort of AUCs would be would compare very well to those sort of models. And so, once again, we sort of think of this as a sign of the potential of using a crowd of lay people in some form in the crowdsourcing pipeline. So what are the conclusions that we can take away? First, which may or may not be surprising, is that the inter-factchecker agreement is not as high as you might imagine. Again, this is not necessarily unexpected because these articles are things that have already been flagged as potentially misleading, and there's not necessarily a binary black and white truth or not truth, but still it's an important thing that we should think about when we really champion fact-checking efforts as done by a single fact checker as a potential panacea for fake news on social media. So that's the first thing, and sort of with that in mind, we find that without doing any research, just judging the headline and lead of an article, a group of untrained, politically balanced lay people agree with the average fact checker doing research more than the fact checkers agree with each other, or as well or more than the fact checkers agree with each other. So incorporating the crowd could be a really potentially promising strategy for combating fake news on social media. And lastly, we find that providing source information does seem to have some marginal benefit in helping people make accurate assessments about the veracity of articles, although the effect is quite small. Thank you so much. Looking forward to answering questions that anyone might have.